Welcome to you all. Particularly like to welcome the students of the Master Duitsland Studies, German Studies. Nice that you're all there. And we'd like to start with a disappointing remark. Fake news is of all ages. In the early modern period, travelers wrote about giants in Patagonia, as well as unicorns in Sumatra. All fake news, of course. Also, dozens of books are written about the propaganda of William III after the Glorious Revolution, or about the military propaganda during the First World War. No news so far. Also, the fight against fake news is not new. Francis Bacon already spoke about the idols of the mind and designed a whole new theory based on empirical knowledge to combat errors. Hannah Arendt, you should say in English, by the way, wrote about the fragility of truth. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, she analyzed how the masses in an ever-changing, incomprehensible world had reached the point where they would, quote, at the same time believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and nothing was true, unquote. Her main question was how totalitarian powers imposed their truth by force and how the people could debunk and oppose these imposed truths. In 1962, Jürgen Habermas analyzed already the structural transformation of the public sphere, in which he underlined the importance of a discussion free of domination. As it was held already in the 18th century, in the coffee houses, the press, and the Freemason lodges of the Enlightenment. Since the 19th century, however, this herrschaftsfreie Diskussion, as Habermas called it, was threatened by the combination of commercial interests and political oppression. So what's new? Okay, this is new. It is the combination of a mobile phone, iPod and internet. And it is only introduced in 2007. You should remind it. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel was appointed in 2005, 2 years earlier. This apparatus changed our personal communication and as well as the way we gather the news ourselves. And it was introduced only in 2007, as I said already. New communication tools may have an important impact on the way we consume the news and also on the way we approach politics. In history, major political changes often are accompanied by major shifts in communication. To give just one example, in the 1920s, the radio was introduced, the cinema became big business, and thanks to the microphone, politicians could address large crowds. And we all know what happened in the 1930s. So it's time to talk about fake news in different contexts and about the concept, its history, how it's conceived by the people, if it is anyway a problem, and if yes, how the regular news media and politics could deal with it, react on it, perhaps oppose it. So I'm very glad to introduce you. By the way, my name is Hanko Jurgens, working at the Duitsland Instituut Amsterdam. And I'm very glad to introduce to you Boris Noordenbos, Associate Professor of Literary and Cultural Analysis at the University of Amsterdam and affiliated with the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. In 2016, he published a book called Post-Soviet Literature and the Search for a Russian Identity. And in 2021, he co-edited the book Post-Soviet Nostalgia, Confronting the Empire's Legacies. And now he's working on an ERC grant which is called Conspirational Memory Cultures Cultures of Suspicion in Post-Socialist Europe. So, glad you're here. And Katie Hull, she has a very interesting CV, splendid CV, I would say, since she first worked for the World Bank Poverty Reduction Group. from 2005 to 2010, then consulted the government of Ghana and wrote speeches for parliamentarians and World Bank principals before lecturing American studies here in Amsterdam. And in between, she wrote a PhD at Georgetown University and published a book called The Machine Has a Soul, American Sympathy with Italian Fascism by Princeton University Press. So very welcome you as well, and would like to ask you to start. What we are going to do is first, Katie will start, talk about fake news in the United States. Then I will shortly introduce the concept of Lügenpresse in Germany, and Boris will talk about how the Russians deal with these matters and conspiracy theories as well. And then afterwards we have a short discussion, and we have a discussion with the public. Katie.
Okay, thanks, Hanko. And I've got a few slides. Promise it's not a boring PowerPoint. Promise. My hair's in the way? Okay, thank you. And I need someone to show the slides. Thank you. Oh, do you want me to get up and do it?
So there's a... Here, there's
a brilliant. I'll click my slides.
There you go.
Okay. Like this? Yes. Okay. So it's probably a statistic that's familiar to many of you, but basically it conveys that according to a number of opinion polls, some 70% of Republican voters believe that Joe Biden didn't rightfully win the US election, the presidential election in 2020. Instead, they subscribe to some version of the idea of large-scale election fraud, despite zero evidence, zero factual evidence that that's the case. And you know, this idea of large-scale election fraud, fraud at the ballots, fraud in mail-in votes, is very much facilitated by fake news that's been amplified on social media. I'll just give the example of one story that circulated on and after election night. I think it's interesting as well because it kind of builds on the conversation that I was having with Boris and Hanko, which is a little bit about the definition. What's misinformation? What's disinformation? What's fake news? What's propaganda? And, you know, is it a question of intent, right? Because this story was that in Michigan, the state of Michigan, Joe Biden had received more than 100,000, I think it was 138,000 consecutive votes, while at the same time, Donald Trump had received 0. The origins of this story was in an error. It was an error of data, not data collection, but just data representation by local election monitors. And they quickly corrected this error. But in the meantime, the story had been picked up, right? And it went from the outer reaches of the internet, 8chan, which is the replacement for 8chan. It's a sort of information board that's a harbinger of, or a harbor of massive conspiracy theories like QAnon. It went from 8chan to Twitter, from relatively fringe people within Twitter to the feed of a major conservative commentator, and then from that person's feed into Donald Trump's feed, and into the sort of imaginations of a large number of Republican voters. So you sort of see the mechanisms between something that was originally an error, then becoming intentional fake news. My goal for the next 8 minutes or so, though, is to do a little bit of what Hanko indicated, which is maybe to give a little bit of historical background and to build on this idea that, you know, fake news in itself, disinformation and misinformation aren't new, and that they've always represented threats to the polity, and in modern America, at least, threats to American democracy. And my own research is very much from the 1920s and 1930s, and I looked at 4 Americans who sympathized with Italian fascism and the way they spread what was a combination of wishful thinking, propaganda, and outright lies about the fascist regime. I'll just give you one example amongst the 4 people I studied, and I'll just show you one example of her journalism. But I think she's a particularly interesting case. Her name was Anne O'Hare McCormick. She wrote for the New York Times. She was writing for the New York Times at the time that, for 20 years, the Times had really been establishing its own reputation as what's known in the US as the paper of record, right? So it was very much priding itself on raising the standards of journalism, eradicating problems around fake news, and reporting only objective truths. And McCormick herself wasn't a bit player for the Times. By 1936, she was the first woman ever to serve on its editorial board. And in 1937, she won a Pulitzer Prize for her journalism. And that's just to say that if the practices of fake news that I'm going to describe were being practiced by someone like Anne O'Hare McCormick at the New York Times, you can imagine the kind of practices that were going on lower down the journalism ladder in the United States, even at a time when standards in journalism were rising. So I'll just give you one particular example of McCormick's journalism. This is a 1926 article. It appeared to be the first interview she ever did with Mussolini, although, as I'll show you, no interview ever really was done. 1926 was an important year for fascism on paper. It was the year that the fascist state announced the corporate state. They called it the year of the corporate state. And they presented this corporate state as a sort of alternative, not a sort of, as the alternative to representative democracy. And the idea was where in liberal democracies like the Netherlands or like the United States, people were voting for geographical representatives who represented their area. In a corporate state, they would be voting for people who represented their economics. So if you were a farmer, and I shouldn't say they would be voting, they would be represented by someone who represented their economics. So if you're a farmer, you would have a representative of farming in the corporate parliament. And that representative would be chosen actually by the fascist leadership, but the idea was that they would be able to represent your interests much better than a democratically elected member of parliament. What's interesting here is that this kind of discourse around corporatism in Italy was going on at the same point as a discourse that was very critical of democracy in all our countries, and including in the United States. So people were very concerned that elected representatives were no longer able to handle the problems of the modern age, that modern economies had become so complicated that it was no longer, that liberal democracy was no longer the right system of government. So this discourse was going on in the United States, in Britain, on the European continent, while fascist corporatism was apparently giving an alternative. That's just a little bit of background. But you know, this article that appeared in the New York Times was essentially a 2-page, it was on the front page of the Sunday magazine and in the inner pages, 2-page interview between McCormick and Mussolini, in which Mussolini appeared to be a very interesting, warm, responsive, lively, knowledgeable leader, and he explained the corporate state to Anne O'Hare McCormick and to readers of the Times. I'll tell you a little bit about the reality behind this so-called interview. In reality, they met for 5 minutes. It was an audience of the kind that Mussolini preferred, a formal meeting, an introduction, and nothing else. It wasn't enough for McCormick to write her article. So to help her along, the Minister of Foreign Affairs sent her a diagram of the corporate state. Everyone needed a diagram of the corporate state because it only existed on paper. It didn't really exist in reality. So he sent her this diagram. Unfortunately, the diagram's not in the archives, but what we have in the archives, in the Italian archives, is a letter from McCormick to the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying, thanks for the diagram. Not enough to write her article. So, it's mid-July. She's had her audience with Mussolini. She's received her diagram. She needs more. She sends the Minister of Foreign Affairs 5 questions about the corporate state and asks him, could you pass these on to Mussolini to get a response? Mussolini never writes the response. Someone in the ministry writes long-winded, very dry and boring responses to these 5 questions. What we do have in the top right corner, you see the M? That's Mussolini. We have him in the top right corner scribbling on top of the questionnaire, "A mese dopo quello dell'Associated." I got quite good at reading his handwriting. That means a month after the article by the Associated Press. Because in September, the Associated Press was publishing another positive article about Mussolini called Mussolini's Faith on a Star. So Mussolini here, as a former journalist, isn't just charging his ministry with controlling the content of McCormick's article, he's actually controlling the pace by which this information's released. It's mid-July. He says this isn't coming out till October. So she writes a few letters. I've skipped that slide, but she writes a few letters. Any news on those questions? Any news on those questions? I really need those questions. I don't want to write the article without them. And in the end, in October, they send her the response. And so she writes her article. And here appears the diagram that they sent her. It's not a diagram sent to her in an envelope arriving at her hotel in Rome. She puts it on the wall of Mussolini's office. "Here it is," Mussolini exclaims, jumping up and leading me to a fresh diagram on the wall. He explains it clearly and patiently, reminding me that he started his career as a teacher. And this is just kind of illustrative. And, you know, for the students, you can find these articles on New York Times ProQuest through the library. It's just illustrative of her article in general. She presents this picture of Mussolini as this incredibly warm, knowledgeable, responsive, available person, when in fact he'd been none of the sort. And I think, you know, just in a minute, I'll just reflect a little bit on that, because we could say this is just kind of poetic license, right? The kind of details that she needed to insert into this interview to make it fly, to make it interesting. But actually, I think the devil is in those details, because if she had presented the truth to her readers of the New York Times, she would have had to say, I got a 5-minute audience with this guy. He gave me nothing. I then waited for 2 months for a bunch of typewritten responses from the fascist regime. Here are the responses, and, you know, decide for yourselves whether these are convincing. But instead, what she presented was something and someone who was the perfect contrast to all the issues that Americans were facing. So while Mussolini was this kind of warm and responsive person, the Americans had President Calvin Coolidge, known as Silent Cal, not exactly a warm or responsive leader. There's a reason why we tend to forget him, right? And they had this whole concern that our representatives aren't representing us. And there was really a very lively discourse about, you know, the problems of democracy and the weakness of democracy. And so I'll kind of just rest it there, but maybe with a reflection that could help us in the discussion when we also bring this up to the present age, which is that I think that, you know, disinformation and misinformation can hit the hardest when democracy is at low points, like it was in the 1920s, and arguably like it is today. And also if we're kind of thinking about policy interventions that we should be making around disinformation and fake news, then we can think about regulatory interventions, and I'd be happy to talk about those insofar as I know about them. But I think we also need to think about kind of deeper interventions in terms of strengthening our democracy to really deal with the root of this problem. Okay, sorry, it was a bit long.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand here because I have a classical lecture, which I will read aloud. Germany is a newspaper country. the US as well, but I was in New York this summer and I couldn't buy the New York Times in Manhattan, which is very remarkable if you compare that to Germany. That Germany is a newspaper country was the conclusion of the Federal Union of Newspaper Publishers in 2017. According to them, 15.3 million newspapers were sold per day, as well as 4 million weeklies and Sunday papers on its release date, so per week. With around 80 million people, Germany was on the 5th place behind China, India, Japan, and the USA. If there's one country where people read newspapers, it is Germany. And indeed, the biggest European newspaper is Bild-Zeitung. But many Germans don't want to know that. Okay. And I would say, not by coincidence, after the Second World War and also after the GDR, people wanted to be informed, to know what is happening in the world and to understand politics, so that what had happened in the years 1933, 1945 would never happen again. In his book Propaganda nach Hitler, Thomas Mergel described how Germans after the Second World War were not easily seduced by fancy election campaigns, but hoped to be informed in a proper way. What was needed was a form of new objectivity, neue Sachlichkeit in politics. Of course, German politicians went to the US to see how the election campaigns in the US were working, but they did not implement this new knowledge at home. No propaganda after Hitler, please. In Germany, as elsewhere, the role of the press as a critical watchdog was and is considered necessary for a healthy public sphere. In 1990, when Jürgen Habermas wrote a new introduction on the structural transformation of the public sphere, he made a rather positive assessment of the state of affairs. On the one hand, he was worried about the growing influence of big media concerns, but on the other hand, it was clear that the press, both television as well as newspapers, both in East as well in West Germany, played an important role in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the successive implosion of the GDR. A better assessment could not have been made in these days. Today, Habermas is much more critical. In his new booklet on the new structural transformation of the public sphere, he speaks of a dramatic loss of meaning of the printing press. He compares the digitalization with the invention of the printing press. After book printing had made us all potential readers, the digitalization had changed us all into potential authors. Now that anybody can participate in the public sphere, there are no deliberative rules anymore, no filters, nor gatekeepers of all this information, which are necessary to find out what is, so to speak, good to know. There are no real exchanges of opinion, but only like-minded bubbles. This leads to a post-truth society where digital platforms determine the rules. In a world of fake news, according to Habermas, it's impossible to grow up without clinical symptoms. Not all reviews of the booklet are that positive. Some critics have asked if the 93-year-old philosopher is at home enough in the new digital world, or if he does not extrapolate the Trumpian world to other public spheres. And this is a very interesting issue, I think. According to a 2018 YouGov poll, 64% of the Germans considered Donald Trump as a greater threat to world security than his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. 64%. Trump's way of doing politics, of accusing the media of producing fake news and of preferring Twitter above the printing press, was something which particularly annoyed German critics. Interestingly, Putin's media strategy, the disinformation campaigns of Russian agents, were often overlooked. This underestimation has been a more general European phenomenon. Think of the Dutch 2016 Ukraine referendum, which should be researched much more. We don't know enough about it, I think. What has happened there? Who was influenced by whom? It's of huge importance to study these things, to know what could happen, what had happened, and also to know what could happen in the future. In order to know that. In a German context, it is particularly useful to focus on the concept of fake news itself, of Lügenpresse. Contrary to what one often thinks of, this concept was used early 2014 when the Ukraine conflict evolved into the Russian occupation of Crimea. At demonstrations, the German press was accused of one-sided coverage, critical of Russia but not critical of the warmongers of NATO. Again, after the crash of MH17, right-wing radicals accused Der Spiegel of producing misinformation, fake news. Lügenpresse bedoel ik, I mean. Since this campaign was not very successful, the link of the concept of Lügenpresse with Russian disinformation campaigns was generally not made. But at the end of 2014, with the rise of Pegida, the so-called Patriots Against European Islamization, the concept of Lügenpresse suddenly became well known. The German newspaper press immediately linked this concept to Goebbels' speeches, in which he characterized the media abroad as Lügenpresse. And this made the attack on German media even more shocking. Suddenly, the quality of newspapers and television broadcasters, which saw themselves as watchdogs and healthy critics of politics, were accused of being too close to Angela Merkel and too uncritical towards Berlin. Since Pegida has been a movement from below, strongly centered in the area of Dresden, it's still difficult to decipher where the concept came from. But the corona crisis gave a new uplift to the concept. Suddenly, not politics, but science was the scapegoat. In demonstrations, the press was accused of being the servant of dangerous knowledge, which could even cost lives. For journalists, it became much more dangerous to show up at these demonstrations. The regular press and news agencies reacted to these accusations by introducing fact-finders and by making their own process of news gathering and news making much more transparent. Interestingly, one may ask whether this makes any sense. People who have accused the German media of being uncritical and even dangerous for public health are not interested in methods to make clear how regular newspapers and broadcasters make their news. They seem to live in another world. Much more important is it to contradict big lies and to debunk those narratives which are carefully constructed by those who have the purpose to create confusion or to unleash social unrest. So what could be a recipe to deal with the new complexities of post-truth? I think it's extremely important to be aware of what has happened in our societies, to know who is influencing who. And also it is important to study these mechanisms. Clearly, some issues lend themselves better for influencing propaganda than others. Since so many people were afraid of their health, COVID was a fruitful domain to turn stories upside down, including the victimization of the unvaccinated, who even identified themselves with victims as Anne Frank or Sophie Scholl. Today, with a war in Eastern Europe, it's more difficult to convince people of one-sidedness of the news. And to conclude, I would say that the new media even brought a more critical, better educated public, which is at least sensible for the question where the information comes from. There are not so many people who can persevere to produce lies. And perhaps we should find new ways to prevent and to contradict post-truth society. And therefore we are here.
All right. My provocation mainly is to rehabilitate the old-fashioned word propaganda as an appropriate label for Russian information campaigns regarding the war in Ukraine. So I will talk about Russian coverage, media coverage of the war in Ukraine, and indeed as the term propaganda, which I sort of want to dust off and recycle. I think it's a much better term than fake news and disinformation for many of the Russian news that I will talk about then. than the other terms. As the use of the term my use of the term propaganda already suggests, there are striking similarities between late Soviet propaganda paradigms and what we see today. And there are also huge differences. We seem to have this sort of, oh, thanks. Yeah, this is probably as simple as it looks. Yeah, there are my first slides. Thanks. So there are similarities with late Soviet propaganda, striking ones, I'd say. And there are also obviously differences. Let's start with Russian state media offline, especially television. In Russia, television is a huge medium. 60% of the Russian population still gathers their news primarily from television, which is quite a large percentage in comparison to other countries. And let me briefly highlight some of the recurring strands, some of the recurring aspects of the major propaganda narratives that the Russian leadership currently professes on the major state-owned and state-aligned TV channels. Many of them, you will be familiar with them, but you will see how things come together in a bit. So, in this sort of propaganda paradigm that you see on Russian state television, Ukrainians, obviously, you all know this, are Nazis, basically, are a remanifestation of the Nazi threat to the Soviet Union in the 1940s. There's also a lot of talk about Ukrainian nationalism, about Ukrainian nationalists. We should not overlook that. It's an important element of the propaganda machine, so to say. And these two concepts, the notion of alleged Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian fascism, are closely intertwined in the propaganda narrative. The basic idea being that any ambition to express, to cherish, to take pride in a distinct Ukrainian culture, any aspiration towards a truly independent Ukrainian nation is ultimately an act of treason towards Moscow. So I could have included here thousands, hundreds at least, of screenshots. I've just picked a few of them. On the left, talk about Ukrafascism, Ukrainian fascism, which is sort of a new term that is used since a couple of years a lot on Russian television. On the right, fascism returns. I mean, this is just something that is hammered in again and again on Russian television, Ukrainian fascism. Then there is another element here in Russian propaganda, and it's connected to the first one. Ukrainian Nazism is, in this propaganda story, ultimately a European and American project. Sort of, the idea is that NATO forces have cultivated Nazism in Ukraine in order to undermine Russia, in order to detach also the Ukrainian economy from the Russian economy and sort of take hold of the Ukrainian market. So Western forces are driven by, say, capitalist greed, by their interest in profit, and that is why they have cultivated Nazi groups in Ukraine in order to basically undermine Russia and take hold of Ukraine. So you hear sort of already an interesting historical resonance here, the idea that greedy capitalists insidiously encroach on Russia's or the Soviet borders. Rather retro, I'd say already. I will get back to that. Another related strand in this propaganda narrative is the role that Western media agencies allegedly play in the Western campaign against Russia. So in the conspiratorial logic of Russian state television, news agencies like BBC, CNN, but also German outlets are directly involved in a smear campaign against Russia. Even stronger, I'd say, if you believe Russian television, Western news outlets are basically instruments of the Russophobic leaders of the West. So on Russian television, Western news items are repeatedly, ceaselessly featured, quoted, discussed as examples of fake news. So we see a form of propaganda that relies on the accusation of Western fake news, of Western propaganda. All of this is occasionally mixed with elements of anti-Semitism. As you all remember, probably this spring, the remark by Lavrov about Zelensky's Jewish identity and Hitler's alleged Jewish identity. I will leave it there. Now, please keep all of this in mind. And I will show you a propaganda drawing from 1981. It comes from the magazine Pepper, one of the most popular satirical political magazines in the Soviet Union, was based in Kiev, had around 3.5 million subscribers. 3.5 million subscribers. What you see here is a Ukrainian nationalist here closest to you, on the sort of at the bottom. A Ukrainian nationalist, also a Nazist, right? I don't know if you can see it, but there are swastikas sewn into his uniform, right here in the middle. We also have a caricatural depiction of a Jew, and together they are pulling a cart on which an allegory of the Cold War is seated. The text is in Ukrainian, the entire magazine was in Ukrainian, and the text on the cart reads anti-Sovietism. So what we see at the back of the cart, I'm not sure if you can see that, it's a pile of garbage. But on the garbage are the antennas of Western media outlets. Voice of America, Radio Liberty. So basically what we see here in this propaganda drawing, sort of satirical but still propaganda drawing from the early 1980s, is a conspiracy narrative in which basically the same forces, Jews, Ukrainians, Ukrainian nationalists, / Ukrainian fascists, and Western media companies work together to undermine the authorities in Moscow. And I find it quite mind-blowing to see the extent to which contemporary pro-Kremlin narratives about the war in Ukraine recycle such basic Soviet, late Soviet propaganda narratives. All right, I'd argue that the concept of disinformation or fake news isn't very helpful in understanding contemporary Russian information network. The point is that in many cases we are dealing not only with lies, not only with falsehoods. Often the Kremlin's propaganda highlights very selectively things that actually happened, but spins it and reframes it to make it fit the preferred narrative of officialdom. In other cases, Russian propaganda professes semi-truths. It does, of course, also profess outright lies. But not all of Russian pro-state messaging can be mapped onto this dichotomy of real versus fake, true versus false, that is implied in terms like fake news and disinformation. In many cases, we are dealing rather with a systematic effort to shape the audience's perception, their emotions, their habits of interpretation, their behaviors. And this is very much in line with classic definitions of what propaganda is. As I said, there are also differences. We live in a digital age, and propaganda must be redefined and sort of understood in new ways in the context of digitalization. Online, today, Russian propaganda often looks like this. It is one example that I have selected. It's actually a recently launched Russian fact-checking service on Telegram called War on Fakes. Vojna s fakami, war fakes. So it's basically a war with fakes, but also fakes about the war, right? The channel has more than 700,000 subscribers. 700,000 is quite a lot. There's now also an English version of this Telegram channel with way less, maybe 15,000, around 15,000 users. And the Telegram channel basically aims to disprove so-called fake news about the war. It takes these fakes largely from Western and Ukrainian media outlets. And what it does is that it basically hijacks the fact-checking format. It appropriates the rhetoric of open source intelligence in order to channel Russian propaganda. So, as you see here, the format is often that it juxtaposes fake news with truth or defect. And that truth always echoes, is always in sync with the official perspective of the Kremlin. So for instance, on the right, the so-called truth, this was today, I think, maybe yesterday. The so-called truth is that NATO had been planning to expand its territory and presence on Russia's borders for years. And the war in Ukraine was only a pretext for a long-planned NATO expansion. So Russia had no choice but to defend itself. This is something that can by no means concluded from the remarks by the chairman of the NATO's military committee, who is cited here in this post. And this is illustrative of the spinning, of the selective reading that is very characteristic of this channel, and I'd say of Russian propaganda in general. And by saying it's fake, it's partly fake, yes, but it's also based on a real speech. I mean, there's a lot more going on than only, you know, lies and falsehoods, right? There's a whole sort of narrative in which these lies and spinnings and reframings are embedded. And I think we should pay attention to that and not obsess over this sort of binary idea between false and true. So what then is the difference between classic propaganda? I've shown you this poster, I've shown you sort of the retro element of Russian propaganda today, but of course there are also differences. Classic propaganda is typically top-down, right? It's unidirectional. It's also, in many cases, unidimensional. There's one story that targets the population through a limited set of state outlets. What we have here is a way more complicated situation, a multi-dimensional and multi-directional situation. War of Fakes cites other news outlets, either as fakes or as trustworthy channels. In turn, it is also reposted again and again and again, reposted and quoted a lot by official channels of the Russian government. Also, for instance, in television broadcasts. It's also reposted by embassies, Russian embassies across the globe. So there's sort of a feedback loop and a set of interdependencies between online and offline outlets. Also, and this is, I think, the most important moment, contrary to classic forms of propaganda, this type of propaganda is participatory. At least it targets its users as cooperators in establishing the truth. So on the left, you see two screenshots, one from the Russian version and one from the English version. The English version of the channel, it's basically the About section, interesting in itself. In the Russian version, users are invited to propose fake news to be checked by the channel. They're also invited to collaborate with the channel in disproving fakes. And users can also, of course, at least in the Russian version, they can comment on the posts of war on fakes. They can obviously share it on their own social media platforms. That's also what they do a lot. Thus expanding and amplifying the facts that this channel has purportedly established. They are invited to become collaborators in amplifying, spreading, establishing a particular version of the truth. Mark Tudors from the Media Studies Department here at the UvA and we are currently working on an article about this channel, analyzing its level of official coordination, which is extremely hard to pinpoint, but also analyzing the rhetorical mechanisms by which it works. And what we do is we spotlight it as a form of participatory propaganda, which is not purely top-down, is also not as grassroots probably as it pretends to be. And in this new form of participatory propaganda, the public, and this is the crucial point I'd say, is both the target of influence and potentially also the co-creator of influential narratives and interpretive frames, right? So what we have is a digitally enabled participatory form of propagandistic messaging. And I think this may actually be quite emblematic for what we see in other national contexts too. So to sum up, 2 more sentences, I'd say let's not shy away from this somewhat old-fashioned term propaganda. And at the same time, let's be sensitive to how propaganda today is different from what it looked like 50 years ago. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Interestingly, you both seem to stress the long-term perspective. Katie, I'd like to start with you. You talked about the lure of fascism in the United States. So what is topical about this lure of fascism?
It's kind of a leading question, isn't it? I mean, I think that one of the lures that we could say is topical for today is that there's a certain constituency in the United States that really wants a kind of a simple message about their nation being the best and putting their national interests first, right? So a lot of that kind of America great rhetoric, I would say, has roots in fascistic tendencies, and then just the sort of deep cynicism around democracy and really a cynicism about human nature, which I think really lies at the heart of fascist enterprises. I would say you see that in, I assume this is a question about Trump. I think you see that in contemporary Trumpism as well.
So you really see this continuity, or is it a sort of reinterpretation or
yeah, I mean,
appropriation?
I think that there's a reason why fascism was a kind of a product of modernity, and that many of the kind of issues that the United States that animate Trump's base were also animating fascist or proto-fascist spaces in the 1920s and 1930s. So, for instance, issues around immigration, economic dislocation. There's a huge discourse of masculinity imperiled, in the US case, imperiled white masculinity, which I think we see in fascism as well.
Timothy Snyder analyzes this also as a sort of fascist mode, in that sense that he considers the way Trump, for example, neglected the election results as a big lie, making it such a big lie that you can really accuse your opponents of creating a whole fake world and saying that your truth is the truth.
Right.
And for him, this is a sort of fascist mode of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's sort of interesting just what Boris was saying about all these labels, right, and how Russia's applying this label of fake news against CNN, and we see Trump doing exactly the same, right? And that fake news is a really difficult and potentially pointless label because it's both used by contemporary legitimate broadcasters to identify disinformation, there's another difficult word, or used again, by right-wing fabricators of mistruths as a weapon, right?
You also, we talked before on this topic, said something about possible solutions, the way one discusses in America to get along with fake news, and perhaps you can say something about it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, you know, with the audience, we can also think a little bit about some of these regulatory frameworks. And, you know, in the US context, social media is deeply dysregulated, unregulated, and I can give more information about that if anyone's interested, and maybe you already know some of the reasons why and what the underpinning legal regime is there. But, you know, really, as I was thinking about this topic in a kind of contemporary context, I was also just thinking around education. And this gets us, again, back to the 1920s and people like John Dewey, who were already saying in the 1920s, if you're going to improve democracy, it's not about creating corporatism or some alternative or elite rule. It's about actually creating a programmatic education, not just around democracy, but just education in general. In the US, again, education's a really touchy topic. It's decided at the state level. It's not federal policy, education policy. And, you know, without going too far, it's a very, very touchy subject in the US at the moment. I don't think that it would be politically very viable to be introducing in red states a policy that was like, now we're going to teach our public school children how to discern fake news from real news. That wouldn't fly because that would kind of go into the culture war battles around critical race theory and all these things. But maybe my little bias as a historian thinks that any kind of education in the humanities, that actually if we're giving children education that just gives them analytical skills, right? I mean, what do we do as historians? We analyze our sources. I'm not saying everyone should just be learning history all the time, but this kind of education, Boris and I were just talking about education systems and certain nations that teach children to really think and ask questions, and certain nations that teach children to learn for exams. And I think we need more of the former and less of the latter.
Okay, thank you. Boris, you also stressed the long-term perspective, and I can imagine that also if you see the power of the Russian Secret Service, which is a long-term history, so to speak. The four most powerful men all met each other when they were in education for the KGB, I think. But there's one thing which I was a little bit curious about. You call it all propaganda, and it's interesting to see how it's sort of exchanged with people from above and from below. But I really also mentioned some really disinformation campaigns, such as the campaign around the MH17, where there was it was important to have many truths. And to really have a sort of conspiracy or well, a disinformation so that nobody would ever know what had happened.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm also not arguing that there is no disinformation happening. There is a lot of it, and it's horrible. And I watch a lot of Russian state television, and it's sickening. But I'm saying that there's more at stake than only outright lies. Right? There's the shaping of a worldview and the invitation of the viewer into that worldview that's going on, and that sometimes happens with total lies and misinformation campaigns, but that also happens in sort of continuous and more subtle ways. And your second point, or actually sort of your analysis of the MH17 information campaign is very characteristic of what propaganda often looks like in Russia, right? So it's not only persuading or convincing the audience of another version than what actually happened, but it's rather relativizing truth in general, sort of relaying a sense that, you know, we will probably never find out because there are so many different versions and everyone has an agenda. So who will say what actually happened? And that is sometimes a very convenient outcome of such propaganda campaigns. So definitely, I'm not saying the truth is not relevant. It is. But even when Russian propaganda sticks more or less to things that actually happened, it's still embedded within a propaganda narrative that inculcates a particular way of seeing the world. Yeah.
Do you see a difference between propaganda for the Russian people and propaganda in foreign countries?
Yeah, there are definitely differences, and there's also overlap. Maybe a very subtle thing that I noticed that obviously in the Russian version of this Telegram channel that I showed you, I mean in Russian there's a particular particle that you can use for a country and that you can use for a region. And in the Russian version of this Telegram channel, it is always na Ukrainie, so we would say in the Ukraine, right? So they're not acknowledging it as a separate state, basically, linguistically. What I noticed in the English version, I mean, this is a detail, but I think it's important, that they write Kyiv, for instance. They're very much aware of particular sensitivities in their Western audience, and they sort of cater to that audience. I mean, that is a little thing, but it shows the extent to which they are aware that they cannot just impose their worldview and translate it sort of across borders to a target audience in the West. Also, what you see a lot in Russian propaganda that targets Western audiences is the incitement of fear regarding gas prices, for instance. Today I saw very interesting, it was from a few months back, they had a very nice item about Mark Rutte visiting Zelensky in Kyiv while there were farmers' protests, and they made a huge item out of it. So you saw the farmers, and then people responded and reposted and amplified the story and said, well, this is all orchestrated hunger in the Netherlands, and meanwhile the Prime Minister is visiting Kyiv. So there's definitely sort of an attempt to push basically the sore points of the Western audience. And I find it quite frightening to see the extent to which there is an awareness of what might be an effective focal point for such propaganda in the West.
And how effective is Russian propaganda?
In Russia, or?
Yeah, well, they seem to me very professional and actually, from the propagandist perspective, not that bad, so to speak.
Well, I find it hard to say because that would imply that I have sort of an overview also of effects and everything. I don't know. What I find interesting and frightening to see is the extent to which the Russian, let's say, information powers that be have understood that just saying this is what happened and this is the story you should believe, that they understand that that does not work any longer in a digital age and in the 21st century. So you have to adopt other formats like fact-checking and other things that are interesting and then channel propaganda through those methods. And I think that is rather smart to some extent. That's rather effective also. If you look at the posts of people who respond to those things, I think they believe that there are these people, sort of a grassroots organization that is establishing what is true and what is not. And that's probably much more effective than telling people this is what happened and you should believe it because it's the party line or something.
Yeah, and to conclude, in your research, you're focusing on conspiracy theories. Could you give another example of it?
Well, yeah, they're everywhere, of course, and also depends a little bit on your definition of a conspiracy theory. But basically, the idea is that, of course, sort of the basic definition is that people in secret collude, work together to bring about some kind of negative, malign, illicit outcome. If you look at the drawing that I showed you, the propaganda drawing, where we have a Jew, a Ukrainian, who are sort of pulling together of the Cold War forward, I think that is an example of people secretly colluding. They seem like enemies, right? A Ukrainian fascist and a Jew, but they're actually working together against Moscow's interests. That is already a conspiracy theory. If you look at what is happening today, sort of CNN, who's constantly presented as secretly, sort of supposedly independent, but actually a direct instrument of the American government, that's also conspiracy theory. So it depends a little bit. It doesn't always have to be, poo stringers behind the scenes, but it's everywhere in its broader definition.
Yeah, it's a broad definition. I would call it propaganda, perhaps.
Well, it's about things that happen secretly, right?
Okay. Okay, are there any questions? Yes. Er komt een microfoon.
With a microphone for the people at home at the live stream.
Okay. Thank you. I have questions to both speakers. One to you. I've read the New York Times for about 40 years, more than 40 years, and I always think of it as a very truthful newspaper. But I get disappointed sometimes. First of all, in 2003, by their position they took in Iraq, and of course later retracted, but also by the example you gave, and it's not the only one. How can I be so sure that the New York Times is a truthful newspaper and that I can always trust? That's my question to you. And my question to you is, do you think it's a good idea that the European Commission prohibited the Russian channels?
I think that the New York Times has improved a lot in 100 years. I think I agree with you. They made a terrible mistake in 2003, as many, many Americans did, and that they owned up to that mistake to some degree. I don't think that they're aware of the extent of someone like Anna McCormick's fiddling, because it's not in their archives, right? So maybe at some point I'll try and publish an op-ed. I'm actually a little hesitant to, because I think that politically I would be playing into the hands of a constituency that I don't desperately want to play into their hands if I'm saying, oh, the New York Times too was guilty of fake news 100 years ago. But I think that, McCormick was writing, her career went right through to the 1950s, but in the 20s she was really writing in the kind of early decades of this professionalization of standards in journalism, and there was a huge emphasis in the time on sort of giving things a personal interest or edge, and she really kind of went with that. So whenever she got a fact, she dressed it up in a person, and that was her style. Right? And people didn't question that style as much as they should. But I don't think you should worry too much about the New York Times. I don't think there's anything better out there, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That's a wonderful question about the EU banning of Russian state channels. I have it's more as a human being that I think that I sort of hesitate with, sort of hang back from the idea that things are censored. But it's quite irrelevant, I think, because this banning of particular state television channels, largely television channels and also websites, is totally ineffective. I mean, it's an outdated idea of how information Russian official narratives reaches, right? So what happens in many cases is that Russian state television, or things like RT and Sputnik, and now also additional channels that were also banned, feature YouTube videos, for instance, from a particular channel. That channel gets a lot of attention from Russian viewers, then ends up higher in everyone's feed, not only in Russia. There's also channels like this, like Warfakes on Telegram. So the idea that if you block the main channels of the Russian state, you will block propaganda, that is an old-fashioned idea of how propaganda works, right? So I think it's most of all, it's not effective. And it can be counterproductive because it confirms, of course, for a lot of people that there are powers at hand at work who don't want us to know what's actually going on or something. Yeah.
From the German perspective, I'm not sure if I agree in that sense that in Eastern Germany there are many Russlanddeutsche are living there, and they were all watching Russia Today, the German version, which is prohibited. I think at the 4th of March, so 1 week after the invasion, quite early, and I think earlier than the European Union prohibited it, I thought. But
yeah, so now in June the European banned Sputnik and RT, and then recently additional channels. So it's quite
yeah, and I think the Russian Germans were really watching Russia Today, and so it is also part of their community.
I mean, I can see that in particular communities that is a very important channel, but I think for the general public there are other ways that Russian information reaches us. Yeah.
Other questions, especially the students, I invite you all, you're here now. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to try and see if I can formulate this correctly. But you focus a lot, like with propaganda and with fake news and all of that, you focus a lot on like newspaper sources and like online sources of fake news. I was wondering what the role of the government is in actually propagating that fake news. And I don't mean in terms of like Russia being pro-propaganda and all of that, but I mean actually in terms of, like even here in the Netherlands recently, there were protests about the big lie, looking at COVID, looking at how like we basically how COVID is a lie, how everything around that isn't true. There's a lot of uncertainty about what actually the truth is and all of this. And I was wondering whether, to a certain degree, governments in modern times and maybe more globalized times have actually become less transparent for bureaucratic reasons or for whatever reasons, which have led to a rise in these sorts of just amongst people in general, that they don't know what the truth is and all of that. That in a very counterintuitive way, governments have helped the rise of this without maybe even meaning to. Yeah.
Well, I think. Do you want to answer?
Go ahead.
I think it's a very important question, particularly because the idea is that the government are the technocrats who don't have any idea what is living here in the streets or in the neighborhoods, and there are no politicians anymore who can really touch the hearts of the people, so to speak, and some really can do. Boris Johnson or Donald Trump. I mean, these are, well, I think very well-abled politicians who really can talk to the people. And I think if other politicians or if you have other views, you need to have answers to this communication talents, and you need to have another communication strategy as well, and governments should really think about it, how to communicate their COVID strategies, so that people would not think, oh, this is all bureaucracy, and why should I do that? And I think this is really a development which, well, only is at the beginning, because people did not think about it so much. For me, personally, for example, 2016 was really a disaster as a year with the Ukraine referendum in the Netherlands, the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump. And in a way, Russia played a huge role, at least in the United States. We know for sure. We don't know exactly if Russia played an important role in the Brexit, and we also don't know exactly what Russia's role was in the Ukraine referendum. But well, we see it. There are some mechanisms today which worry me a lot. For example, the election in Italy and in Sweden really could be seen as a reaction to this big uncertainties created by Putin. And we need answers to that, and we need to think about it, and government should think about it as well. Otherwise, they are depicted as technocrats who are not for us.
Yeah, I think it's a really profound question as well, actually. And I mean, so much of my research is about the appeal of fascism as this, or fascist-like policies in the United States as this easy solution to complex problems, and that so much of this sort of angst and anxiety that was circulating in American culture in the 20s and 30s was really about this distance between the governed and the governed and the government, right? And a lot of it is, as kind of you indicate, a function of complexity and the increasing complexity of modern life that makes matters, highly technical and complicated matters of government, really, really hard to communicate unless you're going to use oversimplifications, which is probably why, you know, politicians who peddle lies and hatred are better at communicating, because Barack Obama is the classic example. He was hesitant, he hedged, he put caveats around things. He gave a much more honest representation of the truth, but that wasn't, it didn't really gel with what people wanted to hear, which were simple stories.
Just to add something, Germany is a very interesting counterexample, I would say, in that sense that for 16 years, a rather moderate woman was a chancellor who was not very well known for being eloquent and speaking, attaching whole squares of people with emotional talks. And Olaf Scholz is also not, doesn't have so much sex appeal, I would say. And so that's very interesting. So the stability culture in Germany is well, something. Until now, Germany did not produce politicians like Johnson or Trump, and that's an interesting phenomenon. We can all figure out
why, can't we? Really? Yes. Well, we can all figure out why.
Yes, you should
right?
answer now.
We talk about this a bit in class sometimes, right? The grand German exception and what it's a reaction against. Right? I mean, they've had their politician, you know?
Yes, but that's more than 70 years ago, so things could change. For example, the Bavarian prime minister has somewhat more exposure, but, well, yes.
So thank you for an inspiring and very interesting talk. I wonder if we could think a little bit more about the differences, because it sounds like we are grappling in every country with pretty much the same problem. But if I look at, for example, the concept of free speech, we have a lot of profound differences, especially between Germany and the US. So how do concepts of free speech actually play into all the things you're talking about? I mean, you know, the classic First Amendment argument is always, if you have bad speech, you need more speech, so that it cancels each other out. The German approach is very different, right? It's much more also state-centered and about wehrhafte Demokratie. So how does that figure actually in these discourses? Or do we see really a kind of pretty much the same challenges and changes in every country? I doubt it a little bit, so I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Difficult question. You want to answer first, or shall
I mean, I've thought about it a bit in the American context, certainly, because it definitely affects the kind of legal and regulatory environment, right? So the internet in the United States and internet content is really controlled by a 1996 law called the Communications Decency Act, and it is very lax, let's say. It has two main parts. First of all, that internet providers and platforms aren't responsible for any content that's posted on them. And second of all, it does give them the right to take content down according to their own private codes, so that they can, and irrespective of First Amendment rights. So that's what enables Twitter to dethrone Trump eventually. It's what enables Facebook to take content down. But there's no law in the United States that's saying you must bring down hate speech. It's up to these individual companies to do what they wish, right? And that they're protected. And if the regulatory environment were to tighten in the US, and there's a lot of discussion in Congress on both sides of the aisle about trying to tighten that environment, then ultimately it probably would go before the Supreme Court, and it would have to face off with what is currently an extremely conservative Supreme Court that made up predominantly of what we call originalists, right? So people who look at the Constitution and say, this was the will of the Founding Fathers, therefore, you know, the First Amendment is central. There's nothing about hate speech in the Constitution, therefore there's nothing about misinformation, therefore that doesn't enter for these kind of thinkers. Just as a little aside, I loved what you said about the way to tackle First Amendment idea of the way to tackle hate speech is with more hate speech, because that's like also the classic response around the Second Amendment. The thing to tackle bad guys with guns is good guys with guns. Let's just kind of throw hatred upon hatred and, you know.
Yeah, I think in Germany the debate is much more institutionalized in the sense that we have this federal system, political parties are all represented in all states, political parties have to cooperate with other political parties, so it is from this perspective very logical that someone like Olaf Scholz, who was the mayor of Hamburg before, rises within the Social Democratic Party and becomes the chancellor. Also, I think the German concept of privacy is, of course, totally different. You cannot download a movie illegally. Yeah, you can do, but you will be fined often for 800 euros or something like that. There are much more limits to free speech, I think, than in the United States. And also there is much more talked about regulation of the press and of the digital media, so particularly to protect democracy. So this, I think there are huge differences, and the idea of protection and the protection of privacy has, of course, a lot to do, I think, with the history of both the Second World War as the GDR in Eastern Germany, where people don't want, their privacy was not protected, of course. You want to answer as well?
Free speech in Russia?
No way. Yeah,
sorry, I have my... Yeah. No, the only thing, I mean, it's a discussion that is totally sort of externalized. I think what happens a lot in Russian propaganda, of course, which has an immense level of control over the voices that are being channeled, right, in comparison to both contexts. But what happens a lot is that Russian state media basically capitalize on the fact that there are so many different heterogeneous voices in the West. And there's always someone who is sort of slightly sympathetic with the Russian perspective, which then is presented as, look what they are saying in the West now, right? And then you have someone who is some kind of marginal person in a marginal news outlet who says something which gets a lot of attention. So basically, it is very much a weakness in our relation, I think, to the Putin regime that we have so many different voices that actually get a platform and that get space and that are seen. And you can always find one and feature it in your own program and frame it in whatever story you want to make out of it.
Question in the back.
Hi, thank you for an interesting talks, and thank you for example, Hanko, about your question about different strategies in Russia, within Russia and outside of Russia, which was eye-opening for me. That was an interesting point. But I have a question, which is relating to Kathy's point about oversimplification. Because at some point, Jürgen, Hanko, you said, oh, well, Trump is a good communicator, and then you kind of responded with, well, he does oversimplify, and oversimplification sells, so maybe he's not a great communicator, but anyway, that's how I interpreted it. And then my point is on that. I've found James Bridle's book, The New Dark Age, interesting, in which he talks about the question, why do we like fake news so much? What's going on here? And at the beginning, you talked about, for example, the mobile phone as an instigator, or and as a microphone might have led to the war. And I, as a media theorist, have a lot of trouble with that, something like that, because I'm not allowed to say technological deterministic things. So my question is, what James Bridle kind of posits is that the world is getting so complex that there is, because of that sense of, oh my God, it's so complex, that there is an inherent growing need for simplification, as you say. And that's what's going on. So he puts it in that wider context of, in general, the world is perceived more complex, to be complex, so there's this need for simplification. And I was wondering, and then I was wondering if that is related to this question of, I was curious how you see that. So my main question is, how do you see that larger context of why is it that is in this period in time we are so fascinated by this? I mean, James Bridle says that for him the conspiracy theory is the logical media format in an age of complexity, as it is the essential oversimplification of the world.
I think it was largely directed to me. I'm happy for anyone to weigh in. It's totally fascinating. I agree with it. At the same point, I think it's so interesting how cyclical these things are. So, we sit in a moment where we feel like an exponential growth in complexity, and it's never been worse, right? But then when you look at the 1920s, you're a media specialist? Media theorist. So you have, Walter Lippmann, who's there writing a book saying that everyone thinks in stereotypes. It's the only way the human brain works, and it works this way because we're bombarded by modern technology, the radio, the sounds from the streets. We're bombarded by various news sources, and the only way that we can filter all this information is by thinking in stereotypes, and that makes us vulnerable to manipulation by politicians and to sort of basically believing lies, right? So I guess I would say let's not panic. I think that what I see, and this is very anecdotal, when I look at kind of young people today, I see them better equipped than I was seeing students 10 years ago. I see them less obsessed with their phones and much more skeptical about what they absorb. So I think that, we are potentially capable. And, I've heard things about how the internet's really in its earliest stages, and maybe as we move on, we'll learn much more about the ways that we can use the internet to calm ourselves down, our meditation apps, and expand our brain and kind of expand our space and time, which is what we all really need to be kind of filtering information for ourselves. I'm not a pessimist, I guess.
Well, I like the idea of, conspiracy theories being an ultimate form of simplification, but I'd say they're also a very specific form of simplification, in the sense that what they do is basically find intention behind things that are chaotic and unpredictable and not driven or motivated through the intention of one particular person. So it personifies a system that is very complex and hard to map out and to oversee. And it describes basically, it gives a face to that system by finding someone behind the scenes who is coordinating all of this. So it's also a particular form of simplification, I'd say, which pivots on intention, on personalization, on agency, on connections, right? So all of that is, but that's, I think that's a very fruitful way to think about it.
Yeah, as a historian, I want to relativize it a little bit at least one example. I liked the term of Jürgen Habermas, neue Unübersichtlichkeit, which is, I thought, well, this is a good description of the way we are living today. And then I discovered it was already written in the 1980s. I think the new complexities, or it's difficult to translate, Unübersichtlichkeit. Yeah. But think about the world in 1918, directly after a First World War. Germany lost, all these countries had to recover. And there were many revolutions everywhere. What a complex world it was. Or think about 1830, when the first trains were driving across the landscapes, and industry was starting. And nobody had ever expected that something like that could ever happen. What a complex world it was in 1830. So I think it has to do with our perception of the world today, which is indeed complex, but then the way to inform about it, that's the discussion, I think. One question.
Agnieszka, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking about the disinformation campaigns of RT, and I was wondering if you see it as information warfare, because if you do so, you can actually also argue that the government has to do more than simply shut down the channel, because it also has the duty to protect their people.
Yeah, of course. That's an interesting question, but it's also a metaphor, right? To see sort of conflicting narratives about what's going on as warfare. Of course, it is part of a conflict. I'm not entirely sure what that adds, though, to the situation. I see the necessity to regulate and to do something with the flow of information. But as I said, I think it's very difficult to pinpoint either particular channels or even particular persons. I think if you are going to monitor information and filter information, and take it very seriously as part of, because we are at war, and the war has also an informational dimension, so to say, right? I think that will require such a tremendous effort, which will have to focus on content, and not only on it comes from this channel. It can also be your neighbor who is forwarding information, reposting stuff. And then you will have to look not at the neighbor or at RT, but at the post itself and analyze the type of information. And apart from the fact that will require so much work and energy and power, basically, you may also question: do you really want that? Do you really want to censor basically information not on the basis of where it comes from, but on the content of that information itself? How are you going to organize it? So I think it's an important question, but there are huge practical and ethical dilemmas, I think, related to it. Yeah. And the point now is that what the EU does is that it thinks that it can ban stuff by very selectively banning channels, even though that information reaches us through Facebook posts, through in all kinds of manners, not only via those channels. It's merely a chain. I see, so you have these Russian state channels. They are merely a chain in the network. But if you take out one of them, it doesn't mean that the information cannot flow anymore. It's just one element in it. But you point to a very difficult question and problem and situation. Yeah.
Thanks, all three of you, obviously. I wanted to follow up on that question about complexity, or I would say the experience of complexity in that inciting then simplistic discourse. So what would be maybe the socio-economic or materialistic or material, if you will, side of that, in the sense that if I would say, if you look at the 30s of the 20th century, or I suppose today, or in the Netherlands, the Fortuin Revolt, that's also a period, I suppose, of at least felt increase in inequalities and like socioeconomic downfall. this whole idea, I guess, global idea of haves and have-nots, and how that incites populist or simplistic discourse. It's a bit of a broad question, I suppose, but how would you want to reflect on that?
On the frame, you mean? How would you react on the frame?
Well, to what extent? I don't feel like that complexity question, if I understood it well, said on the basis of this book that if people grasp the world as more complex, they will need simplistic discourse, or they are more prone, I guess, right? If that's the right way to put it. But what is then the socioeconomic fundament of that? I'm sorry for not.
No, it's a good question. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about the US context. I guess the way I'll answer it is to talk a little bit about the US context that led to the rise of right-wing populism in recent years, right? And it is really it's a story about deindustrialization and growing cultural equality. So the deindustrialization has impacted a white working class that historically was very, very comfortable in the United States. And at the same time, there's been, yes, growing economic inequality, but a sense that women and people of color have more rights in society. And so while they're still economically, probably the average white working man is probably economically better off than, not probably, is certainly better off than the average black woman. Again, it gets back to a little conspiracy that they believe that a combination of democratic liberal elites have worked together with minorities to disenfranchise them as white men and white working class people, right? So it's a complex picture. Does that a little bit answer your question?
Yeah, it's the big problem of social democracy, of course, that there are no answers, or answers are not convincing enough, at least to this social economic divide. And then what you see in Britain, Boris Johnson wins the red wall, so to speak, whereas it's not in the interest of the people in these regions to have a party which is very neoliberal at this moment. But I think that's also a question of communication and making questions as simple as possible. And the Tories are at least more convincing to the voters than the Social Democrats, who are not able to convince their voters that there is a social economic question, which is even more important than this national idea of global Britain, so to speak.
Could I perhaps ask a question to Boris as well, if there's no further questions from the audience? There is one? Okay. Yeah, you can go first.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you so much for your talks, which were very interesting and inspiring. I have a question about the social media platforms. We talk a lot about channels, amplifying, of course, fake news or disinformation. We talk about people posting content. I'm curious to know your view about the accountability of the social media platforms. I'm talking about the Meta, the Telegram, the Googles of this world.
Yeah. Well, that's a huge discussion, of course, whether they're actually a platform or sort of responsible also for the content. I mean, that's a whole legal discussion, partly. I will say something about sort of the difficult situation I think that we are in, is that in many cases we now hold those companies responsible or basically assume that they should take more, double down on their monitoring of content. I think there's something very contradictory and paradoxical in the situation, because what we are dealing with in many cases is social media platforms that capitalize on a particular form of attention that benefits things that are remarkable, weird, out of the ordinary. So there is something within the very commercial logic of how many of these platforms work that benefits a particular type of information that is not all disinformation or something, but it includes out of the ordinary stuff, including fake news and rather, weird stories that are basically untrue. And now we are asking these companies that have built, to some extent, their business model on grabbing our attention with weird stuff. We are now asking them to make sure that people don't see weird stuff that is untrue, right? So there is something very contradictory, I think, in making those companies responsible for that. I mean, they have a responsibility, but they may not be the right people and the right bodies to carry out that responsibility.
Maybe I could just add to that quickly, and I think it's a really good point, and I think there was an article in a journal called Science that showed how and why fake news spread faster than real news, and it was exactly for this reason that the human brain actually responds to things that are novel and surprising, right? So, but at least in the US, in terms of US regulation, it is really, really weak. And there is a strong argument to say that that regulation was created for a very different internet. It was created for the internet of 1996 when it was multiple small platforms. And now we're kind of bordering on a world of 3 virtual monopolies, right? Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And that those companies do have absolutely incredible resources so that they could be putting more resources. I mean, I've heard things about, the original content moderators at Facebook were a group of 12 people, and they were just basically told to take down things that made them feel strange in their gut, right? So they're kind of always on a back footing and catch up, and they're only responding when it's in their interest because it's affecting public perception of them so negatively that then they respond, right? But they've got the resources to do more.
In Germany, one can say that the right-wing circles are often organized on Telegram, and that they use various names because they have the risk of being forbidden very quickly. So what they do is they use a name, and then, well, they're threatened to be forbidden, and then they use another name and go on with that. So a student of mine wrote a master's thesis about it, and he really had to, during the writing, some of these sites were forbidden, and then, he had to find them on a new place, and the same information was often copied and brought to a new place under a new name. And this which would be for Telegram very easy to identify if they wanted to. Yeah. So we're not holding them accountable for that work. Yeah. Major democratic issue. And one of the results of it is that if they want to go somewhere, or if there is something to a demonstration, for example, they can organize themselves very quickly, often much more quickly than the police would know, because they have their circles and their pubs as well, by the way, and so they could easily organize groups to go somewhere. They're much more linked as well. Yeah, but then we have to stop because the organization is very strict. There's some small questions, please.
It's just to add on to this whole subject of regulation. We always focus on social media nowadays, and the social media companies, the larger companies behind that. But especially in America, there's also larger companies like Fox News and CNN who, in this conversation, not, in my opinion, not escape regulation, because they're also for-profit companies that have built their business on shock value and definitely propagate fake news in a way that what you mentioned earlier, Boris, about Russia legitimizing certain points by quoting Western media. It's very much in the news lately that Tucker Carlson is someone who's very much propagated within Russia, even quoting himself saying fake news points. But we consider them in a way traditional media, while they are both very, very young companies who have not the pedigree that a New York Times would have, for example. So I'm just wondering, like, how do you view regulating those companies as far as fake news goes?
I'll keep it really brief, Robin. I think it's a really excellent point. I sort of disagree a little bit about CNN. I think it's outrageous for some reasons, but maybe it's just my political bias sneaking in. I don't think it's been too outrageous in recent years reporting on the facts, but it's something that we were talking about in conversation on Thursday. The most powerful forms of fake news are really those that interact across the boundary between quote-unquote traditional and new media, right? So I agree with you.
Okay, there were some questions, and then we, or not.
Thanks. Thanks for the
Shall
interesting...
we gather the questions? I've got 3 questions, and then, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting talk. Boris, you talked about the propaganda adapting to the digital age. Now, do the government and also reliable and trustworthy newspapers or news rooms in general also have to adapt now and change their style to almost counterattack these propaganda? And don't they have also a responsibility as well to do that? Yeah. So we talked about accountability of a telegram, but shouldn't we also start by the government or those traditional news?
Okay, you had a question yourself or not?
No, but we can skip that. So
okay, and you had a question in the back?
Could you keep your hand raised, please? Oh, yes.
Thanks. Yeah, this is about something that was said earlier about the interesting notion that within Russia there is more propaganda and this notion of convincing the people to a certain viewpoint, right? As you that we're seeing here, like the war on fakes. But also this idea that as you mentioned, MH17, where it was more not so much about convincing, but about confusing, you could say, about creating. There are so many viewpoints, and oh my God, who knows what is true anymore? Is what Adam Curtis calls "oh dearism." You know, like, oh dear, I don't know what to believe anymore, and I have this sense of apathy. And he even goes further in saying that the whole what Russia is trying to do in that sense is attack the fundamentals of Western society, which is the ability to find truth, the Enlightenment ideals, which I find very interesting. But that's my question is, we've talked a lot about this notion of convincing, you know, the classical propaganda, and the historical. The historical evidence of that, as we found way earlier. But I'm curious about this notion of confusing, the second strategy of confusing. Do you, Katie, have you seen also this notion, this strategy a lot in historical terms? Have you seen confusion as a strategy as much as you've seen maybe convincing?
No. I think that's new. That's so interesting, right? Oh, sorry, because we should respond to this as well. But I think it's so interesting because maybe that is a little bit more of a function of what you're saying about the world getting increasingly complex, that confusion becomes a more vital strategy than just pure communication in the kind of, in the sort of classic age of propaganda, it was more communication.
Mm-hmm. I can be very short. Given the vulnerability of knowledge and facts and truth, I think governments should really care about it and develop a strategy. But that would be a next meeting in SPY 25, I think.
Could I add one thing? And sorry, Boris, after you.
Yeah, maybe I can respond to both questions at once. Let's see if I, if I can manage.
Superman!
No, but they're related because indeed, what you say, it's not only about convincing, it's also about confusing. For instance, in this Telegram channel that I've shown you, I've seen, I think, 8 or 7 versions about what happened with the maternity hospital in Ukraine, and they contradict each other, right? And it doesn't seem to be necessarily a problem for the channel. It's just overwhelming people with information and breaking down their basic idea that truth will ever be established. And that relates to your question, I think. I find it, and I don't have an answer to that, but I find it a very important one. How do you respond to this level of basically eroding a general belief in truth in general. What can you do as a response to that? How can you disprove a website or a Telegram channel that aims to disprove things that actually happen, right? So where do you start with that? It's a very important question, and I feel very depressed about not even imagining any possible direction for an answer to that question. So I think you point to an important point. Yeah, painfully important.
Thank you very much. Enough to discuss in a pub or somewhere else, because we're finished now, and it was a very complex topic on complex issues, and we try to simplify it a little bit, and I hope it happens, and I hope you have enough thoughts going home.